Architectural delight. Oh, that's right. We're talking architecture. If talking about beauty is wrong, we don't want to be right. Eclectic, modernist, futuristic, guardian, cutting edge, rationalism, vernacular, visionary, pre-postmodern, romantic, invention, beauty, baby, beyond style, with your architect hosts, David Andriozzi, Elizabeth McNicholas, and Dan Morales. Architectural delight, baby. Yeah. Feel me? Oh, come on. Let's get it. Ow. Oh. It's all here, folks. Look no further. Don't go anywhere. Right here, Architectural Delight.
Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Morales, along with my co-hosts Elizabeth McNicholas and David Andriozzi, three architects with three very different perspectives and all in search of a new narrative. We are here with the support of the New England chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, the ICAA, Traditional Building Magazine, and the Residential Design Magazine. Thanks for being with us. At Architectural Delight, we believe that buildings should speak to the places that they are built, culturally and conceptually, but most importantly, they should delight. We believe that regardless of style, costs, or technique, people tend to save the buildings they love the most. Without architectural delight, no building can be truly sustainable.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, David. Today, we welcome Steve Mouzon, who is, among many things, a principal of the New Urban Guild in Miami. The Guild was instrumental in the creation of the Katrina Cottages concept and continues to foster the movement, including sponsoring the website katrinacottages.com. Steve's Katrina Cottage 8 was notably awarded a Charter Award by the Congress for the New Urbanism. The Guild Foundation is the nonprofit educational arm of the Guild, which sponsors a number of workshops, tours, and seminars that fill several of the gaps that previously existed between theory and practice. It also supports the Guild Tool Foundry. Steve is additionally a principal of Mouzon Design, which provides a number of town building tools and services. His house plans have been featured repeatedly as Home of the Month in Southern Living, Coastal Living, and Cottage Living. Steve is town architect of several new and newish hamlets, villages, and neighborhoods around the country using a unique method of communicating principles, not just particulars. Steve has authored or contributed to a number of publications in recent years, including Biltmore Estate Homes with Southern Living, Architectural Elements, Traditional Construction Details, 1001 Traditional Construction Details and Traditional Construction Patterns, those are all with McGraw-Hill, Gulf Coast Emergency House Plans, A Living Tradition, Architecture of the Central Gulf Coast, and the award-winning A Living Tradition, Architecture of the Bahamas. Steve is also continuing to shoot new editions of his catalog of the most loved places. The catalog typically includes every structure built before or about 1925 in certain historic towns or districts. He lectures frequently and widely across the country and abroad, and is a staple at the Congresses for the New Urbanism. Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for coming.
Delighted to be here. Really looking forward to this. It's the idea of actually having a conversation instead of a presentation is a welcome change from my normal territory.
You just don't know what we're going to throw at you.
More interesting that way.
Let me start with a tough one, maybe, or a good one, which is what is green, the good and the bad and the ugly of the term, because as we've seen it arrive through LEED and become the sort of commercial thing, it seems to have taken on a presence of one thing, but there seems to be another green which is starting to emerge, which is sort of designed through resilient, good design that's related to culture and is accepted by the people, becomes resilient, and therefore that's success. But I'm curious what your perspective of green is.
Well, you know, there's two very different views of that. On the one hand, what I call the original green is the sustainability that kept humans alive through through countless generations until we're here today. And because if our ancestors had not been able to adapt to their places in conditions, they wouldn't have survived. And so that's one thing. Like I say, literally that just means staying alive in a way that we tolerate and even hopefully love. The other type is something I call gizmo green, which is basically the proposition that with better equipment and better materials, you can achieve sustainability. And that is a part of the picture, because if you don't live in the Bahamas, let's say, where it never gets too hot or too cold, but it's kind of temperate all year round because of the ocean temperature, then you probably need equipment of some sort for the most extreme days of the year. Like here in Alabama, where I live now, in Tuscaloosa, it can get down to 0 and it can get up to over 100. And at those extremes, you're not going to be comfortable. You might not even survive if you're not wrapped up real well in the wintertime. So so that proposition of better equipment and better materials means that if you want to be green, everything that about how you built today, both built your home and your businesses or your workplaces and all this, and indeed your life, it all needs a major upgrade. And of course, if you're buying better equipment, better materials, and throwing the old stuff away, then the better stuff is going to cost more money. So basically, the core proposition of Gizmo Green that they don't actually say is, you're not good enough, and we have a lot of stuff we need to sell you. So that's kind of the big distinction between the two.
And really not talking about other important things. Where are the products made? Who's making them? Are they really green? It's about commercialism of a new shtick. That's what I see a lot of green. I find a lot of hypocrisy in some of the products that are out there.
Well, and I actually sat on the what did they call it, a committee or whatever, steering committee or something, I forget the exact term, but for the USGBC on their lead neighborhood standards for, I don't know, about a year, until I got kicked off for not because of saying anything outrageous, but for simply not showing up for enough meetings. I kind of go, my life is made up of a bunch of rabbit holes down which I go until I go down another rabbit hole. And anyhow, so I always get kicked off of boards for that reason. But anyhow, yeah, it was, and the problem is too, that there is a very narrow focus that, so you can actually get your neighborhood LEED certified, even if the buildings themselves are just plain old construction. You can also get a building certified. It can be LEED Platinum in a place where you have to drive everywhere to get there, or the community as a whole can get, the community as a whole can't get certified, but I've been working for a number of years on an alternate system, the original green rating system that is meant to say, so you have to look at the sustainability of the community, of the neighborhood within it, and the buildings within that. And so it's kind of like a batting average. You multiply, like if you get 0.98 on one thing, but 0.2 on another thing, then that gets you to 0.49. But if you get 0.1 on that, then you got 0.004, So because it really all must work together. You can't just look at one little thing and say this is great, because that very narrow focus is really the intent of that is to sell us stuff for what the narrow focus is, and I tell you something. This is not something that was part of what you asked about a moment ago, but it's something that is just watch and see where this goes. Okay. I think that the advent of smart things, smart devices and whatever, is one of the greatest. It's we had planned obsolescence that began 100 years ago when industry realized that if we make stuff wear out in a decent amount of time, then people have to buy more. There was an airplane company back in the 1930s or 40s, I forget when they're founded, but anyhow, it's called Taylorcraft. And if you bought a Taylorcraft single engine plane, it might last longer than you do. But they went out of business because nobody was buying replacement planes. And so, but the smart stuff, you can have you can still be using a refrigerator from the 1960s, but if you get a smart refrigerator that's supposed to do all this good stuff for you, but if when the operating system's upgraded, then you have to upgrade the hardware at some point. For example, I had to get a new MacBook Pro because of the software upgrades. I was several years behind, but that when you have to replace equipment, replace cars and everything else because the operating system changes, then that will be the greatest coup for planned obsolescence in the history of industry. And so whereas, and I'll put it this way, the consuming economy values things by how quickly they're used up. Now, if you, God forbid, have a terrible car wreck, your car is demolished and somebody else's is as well, and you're laid up in the hospital for months recovering from your injuries, that is a great event for the consuming economy, okay, because a lot of money got spent. If on the other hand, the sustaining economy is one that is built upon how far things are handed down, not how quickly they're used up. And so the economic operating system of the original green is a sustaining economy that where things can be used for generations and even centuries into the future.
I love that packaging, sustaining economy versus consuming economy, right? Because I mean, so much of the early criticisms of the, lead rating systems was that it was all, capitalism based, but out of necessity, right? Because, if there's the Pope shit in the woods, like if you can't publish, and spread the word about the things that you're doing, then what sort of traction are you going to be able to get? And if you've got to sort of write about this in magazines, and the magazines are supported by advertisers, right? Sort of that's
Exactly.
sort of the nature of things, right? But you've had this different model, and as I understand it, you've had it for decades now, Steve, where my understanding of your career has been that you're sort of like essentially an original, you set out, whether intentionally or not, I guess you tell us, but I mean, you're an original influencer, like pre-social media influencing. You've gone about sort of like preaching the good news about, essentially now it's a sustaining economy, right? But I mean, your career track has been so heavily focused on writing and speaking, sort of old school influencing and thought leading. Can you tell us a bit, sort of high level, about what your experience in that space has been? Do you feel, are you spreading the good word to new ears? Is it more sort of preaching to choir? Sort of tell us a bit about, just sort of like your career story and how you've come, where you've come from to be where you are today.
Sure. Well, it actually all started the day after Thanksgiving, 1980. So over 40 years ago now. We'd had too much turkey to eat the day before. And so the next day we said, we're still uncomfortable, let's go walk. Well, I was raised in Huntsville, Alabama, which was a tiny little mill town at the end of World War II. And then the Army Missile Command and NASA moved there. And so it all got built in the 50s and later. And so and that's actually where the German rocket scientists came in. And so I grew up with, my dad was a cabinet maker, so he was one of the few rocket scientists in town, fathers of my my classmates. And back then it was very gender specific, but anyhow. And so but yeah, so in that day after Thanksgiving, we couldn't just walk around in Huntsville because it's all sprawl. So we went out, drove 20 miles to the little hamlet of Mooresville, Alabama, which was actually the first state capital, but it was only 9 square blocks, so 3 by 3. And walking around and photographing there that day, I was trying to absorb just everything about it. My dad had taken me there as a kid, but I hadn't been there in years. And I was in my 3rd year of architecture school at the time. And so it's my wife, Wanda, my sister, Susan Henderson, and her boyfriend at the time. The 4 of us were out there and walking around, and it was like, wait, our professors tell us that we are the greatest generation of architects ever because we now have computers. We got, our builders have power tools, our bankers have clever mortgages, so we should be the best ever. But here's a place built by simple farmers and tradespeople beginning in 1818, where they had none of those things, and they have built a better place with better buildings than all of the best experts are able to do today. And how is that possible? And then, but the even bigger mystery was, okay, you can see how if you have some brilliant people that come in and they can do that. But then the real mystery was, how do you pass that wisdom down to the next generation to where they can continue to do what you've been doing, as opposed to needing just some genius there to show up and then they die, And I had no idea, but I took the mystery home with me. And I kind of, you might say, I fed it and watered it and gave it a place to live, and it's sort of like, now I'm no Einstein at all, okay, so let me be clear about that, but I do like a lot of the things he said. One of the things he said was that I am not that much smarter than anybody else. I just stay with problems longer, okay? So it was, so I've been thinking of all this stuff for decades, and 24 years later, there was a design charrette in Jackson, Mississippi, and at the end of the charrette, we had the celebratory dinner, and then we were back at the B&B, the design team, and somebody asked Milton Grenfell the fateful question. They said, Milton, why is it that you have all these bell-cast eaves in this part of the country? And he said, well, this is a hurricane zone, so if you build a roof that's too steep, it'll fail in overturning. If you build it that's too shallow, it'll fail in uplift. So the sweet spot is like an 8 and 12, 9 and 12 for survival in hurricanes. But we also have a lot of torrential rains. And if they come off in a sheet, they'll dig a hole in the yard or trench in the yard. But if we break them with the bell cast eave, that comes off in more of a spray. So wait a minute. How did he start out? What did he say? It was, we do this because that's it. That's the key I've been looking for all those decades, of if you put every pattern in language of architecture into those terms, where you open up the rationale of each pattern. We do this because this is why. It allows everybody to think again, and you actually can have a living tradition as opposed to something that you can only be a part of if you have all the right books, and so that changed absolutely everything. And so that also opened up really that enlightened so many things about what I've been trying to think about on what I now call the original green, and it opened a whole lot of doors. And so then I began blogging on the idea in 2008, I guess it was, and so what's that, 15 years ago now. And what I discovered was that if you put half-baked ideas out there as opposed to something perfect, you get a lot of engagement with people saying, hey, how have you thought about this? And whereas had I held on for the big reveal, it would have been an embarrassment, as opposed to engaging with kind of the hive of minds, if you will. And so that's been something that has been very helpful. And then just one last thing, and that is that when the book came out in 2010, it became a platform upon which many other ideas were built that I've kind of been working on since then. Like, for example, this idea of walk appeal, that it's no longer good enough to be a place that's walkable, where you're able to walk. it needs to be appealing to walk so that you really want to go out there and spend some time. And there's just so many other things that, like outdoor room design. If you can entice people outdoors into a great either private outdoor realm or a public outdoor realm, then they get acclimated to the local conditions. And so on all but the most extreme days of the year, they can open up the windows and do what I call living in season. It's kind of like eating in season, but it's living in season. And when you do that, you find out the most efficient equipment is that which is off. So you don't need to run it all through the year, and so you become you really do become more adapted. And so anyhow, but I could go on for weeks about all these things that the original green has become a kind of a platform or a foundation for building upon. But I'll say one thing about it. In the beginning, in 2008, when I was first trying to kind of formalize or systematize the set of ideas that would be something that could spread, I said to myself, I realized one day, I said, I could make this whole thing is an apology for, at the scale of urbanism, the principles of the Congress of Urbanism, and at the scale of architecture, for the range from vernacular to classical of traditional architecture. And I could do that, but then would that not be just as much greenwashing as a manufacturer who wants to have a story to tell about their stuff, so you should buy their stuff? And I realized I would be every bit as hypocritical in doing that. And so then I said, well, what are the essential things about living in a place? Now, what makes it a sustainable place to live in? And the first thing is, if you can't eat there, you can't live there, not for very long. And of course, now we get food from all over the world, but for almost all of human history, you could look at, even a long time ago, you could still get your spices and stuff from a long ways away because, they didn't weigh much, they were small. But people were always able to look out onto the fields and onto the waters from which their main ingredients came. So thinking in those terms, and instead of saying, how can I defend the things I do for a living and sell more of them, that really came up with a whole different formulation than what it would have been had I taken the normal approach. And like, for example, I have all of my classicist colleagues typically begin with beauty, but I realize that the architecture community and indeed most of common culture today, or popular culture today, has been inoculated against beauty for a few centuries by whoever the German philosopher was that first said beauty is an eye of the beholder. And so I said, what is more compelling than beauty? And that is, it's things that we love. I can look at something that is beautiful. Beauty moves me to admiration, but love moves me to action, And so if you're wanting something that will actually move you to help sustain it for your life, for lifetimes, or even centuries, or possibly even millennia, then it needs to be something that people can love, and not just love as a passing fashion today, but to love because of deep-seated human needs, that we're hardwired to resonate with these things. And again, I could go on for days about that too. I'm going to take a breath.
Oh.
But that's kind of the basics of what you asked.
Well, you put a lot out there, so it's hard to know where to work off of. I mean, the original point that you made about your inspiration of the original green almost sounded like a functionalism, where you were motivated and struck by the importance of a break in a roof to do this. But then when you transition to love and beauty, and in my mind, beauty leads to love. Beauty is almost like these Italian Renaissance architects would say, is a manifestation of love because it's an emotional appeal. So maybe could you speak to how the way you were driven by the functional realization of a roof, and therefore that's tying it to the local culture, as opposed to just being in love with the store, or being in love with the goofy Tudor revival, designs of a neighborhood in Queens done by Trowbridge, Riverside. In other words, I don't know that it has to be either or, but I think it's probably a mix of the two. But I don't know that everyone might recognize or be thinking about consciously the way you and I do as architects, the reasons behind things. So maybe could you speak to how, what do you think beauty is, and how do you think it's different from lovability?
It definitely plays a role. There's no shadow of a doubt in my mind in that. And let me kind of frame it this way, and that is that, and this is another useful device that's been built on the Rediscovering that I found very useful for years, is working as a town architect, and that is that it's what I call the vernacular classical spectrum. And by that I mean that at one end are the very simple buildings that are where the townspeople just build the town, built of the locally available materials and all that. And that most people will look at a very vernacular building and say, wow, that's really charming. And charm is one sort of love, whereas or one motivator to love, I should say that. And then, but the very classical things at the other end of the spectrum are ones that people look at that and they say, wow, that is really elegant, isn't it? And then of course there's it, and it's not just those two endpoints. It actually is, I maintain that it's actually spectrum. I say that because I kind of grew up on the spectrum, you might say that. But that's a different story. But it's so people resonate with different things, and so we need the entire spectrum of from the vernacular to the classical in a place, because otherwise you just get one setting of people and that just resonate with one thing. And for example, years ago, my first planning gig was at a place called Gorham's Bluff in 2001, and the original plan had been done by a wonderful architect, but it was kind of like he didn't do that much planning, but he had an entire monoculture of 75 by 100 lots, and so it appealed to one segment of the market and left most other people out, and so it didn't fare too well economically. And so the same thing happens with if we calibrate to only one type of lovability, like the very most elegant or whatever, then it will leave other people cold, because they just, that's not what they resonate with. So we need the full range of things that people can resonate with, and then that resonance leads to love. So that's something that I found very useful and really essential, for a long time now.
The idea about the vernacular, you probably have heard in the early 19th century, when pattern books started coming out and all sorts of styles started appearing everywhere and sort of overriding the vernacular, if you will. This is a bit of a semantical point, but on some level, the vernacular is now just another style, if you will. If someone asks me to do something in the vernacular, I'll study it, I'll approach it, I'll think about, the locals and this, and I'll do all the things that'll make it believable, as a vernacular building, versus someone who wants something high style or something that's super shingle style, depending upon where they are, whatever it is, So in that sense, when you're providing this scale, if I think the vernacular nowadays to the old definition of it, you're talking about what the builder does with what he's got. And so if you go to some local guy, I work with builders, they're going to build what some people might call a McMansion or a monstrosity of Fipon and Palladian detailing, but that'll truly be vernacular, because they'll be appealing to Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Smith wants to show the whole neighborhood that she's a fancy pants and she's traveled to Italy and she wants a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So it almost feels like, on an intellectual way, the whole spectrum makes a lot of sense, but in the modern world, it just seems like a much more artificial construct, and so can you speak to how that hits the ground in terms of the realities of a builder versus a high-end architect who does bespoke architecture in whatever style the client wants.
Let me go back to the 19th century version that you mentioned just for a moment, and that is that, well, let me actually go to something much more current. I believe that you've worked with DPZ at some point in the past, right?
Yeah.
And I have I've never worked there, but I've been a consultant and been on many charrettes, or multitude of charrettes, I should say, not just many charrettes. But the first day on every charrette I've been with them on is to go out and look at the old things in the area, well, both old and new. And over the course of, because my role was mostly architecture, working with them, I would try to, over the course of the charrette, to sort of systematize what I saw of the old genetic material into something that builders could build today. And so that is, but that's still vernacular as a style.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the best of vernacular as a style, in my opinion, was when I think McKim Eden White, to my knowledge, had kind of the major role in this, but there were other folks involved. But of systematizing the old Cape Cod and broader New England vernacular architecture into what we now know as a shingle style, and so that was kind of the high point of systemizing, at least in the U.S., a local vernacular into a style. Unless you go west and look at, say, Santa Fe, for example, but what's happening today is really a corruption of both the 1800s version and also the 2000 version. In what you mentioned about wanting to show that I miss Fancy Pants in this place, and collecting a bunch of stuff from, there is one case that I'm aware of that actually worked out well, and it's actually stupendously well, because Dan Camp had such a great eye, and that's the Cotton District in Starkville, Mississippi, about 90 miles from here. And he was able to actually put that together in something that if you haven't seen it, you really must. I mean, it's great on so many counts. So, but that's the only case I'm aware of in my lifetime where that's actually worked out well. So, but yeah, what gets called vernacular today is mainly assembled by stuff that you buy, not stuff that the townspeople are building with what's close around them. I regret that people use the term vernacular to mean cheap junk that's thrown together.
Do we adjust the menu of building materials to reflect sort of the reality that we're not operating, we've cut down all of the old growth woods now. And so, yeah, the builders are going to Home Depot and Lowe's to get their supplies, no matter what corner of the country they're in. Does that affect how you sort of recommend buildings be conceived?
Yeah, if we were to try to build with wood again today on the exterior building, Andres Duane now says that I have what we built at Seaside is a place that consumes great wealth just to keep it maintained on the outside from what our code was at the time. So in places where I work as town architect, I'm saying that's not realistic. Let's look at materials that actually can be, well, I have a couple of rules. Number one, if you fake it well. Okay. Don't do a bad fake that's obvious.
That's always been a rule, by the way, in architecture.
Yeah.
From the Romans with their little cladding on.
Yeah, exactly. But I have two standards of it. One is the arm's length rule, and that is at arm's length. Is it a good representation of the material it's intended to represent, even when you touch it? And then the eyes only rule is for everything from the second floor on up, is it indiscernible from what it's intended to represent. And so for years I said that I hoped that we would be able to get to the point someday that we value our buildings enough again that we actually build them to be the real thing as opposed to not. And then I met Clay Chapman, who is this, he's an artist by trade, but he is an artist in load-bearing masonry now, and does what he calls the 1,000-year house, where it literally is built in a way that the shell of the building will last for 1,000 years, even though you may do many things with the interior, over the centuries. And so that is a great move in the right direction. He tends to get all of his brick secondhand, that it's salvage brick from a building nearby that's been taken down or something like that. And so if anybody doesn't know about him, if you're on Twitter, his username is 1,000-year house, 1000 year house, and it's fascinating to see some of the things that he's talking about. And so anyhow, that gives me great hope that we're moving back toward, or at least we can see an avenue for moving back toward that way of building, as opposed to just assembling a bunch of products. We don't really even have builders today. We have assemblers, but in terms of what they're assembling, in places I'm town architect, I've long advocated for assembling of simpler parts, that rather than trying to buy just a whole full assembly of stuff and just stick it in the wall wherever it goes and hope it works. So there's glimmers of hope now, but it's mainly in what you edit out. Say we won't do that. Let's build build simpler buildings, but that do some things really well. And so we haven't arrived there yet by any stretch, but there are hopeful signs now that weren't there 40 years ago.
That's fascinating. It's interesting that you mentioned earlier about sort of the importance of the house connecting to the street or the environment. And it brings me back to a freshman in college reading Jane Jacobs and talking about her. That's systematically, that's how the life and the death of the American city, I think it was called. That's how a city lives. That's its system. It's the eyeballs on the porches that are protecting the street and keeping the riffraff away. And the minute you start to eliminate those porches, then all of a sudden it allows things to happen on that road. I mean, think about that. Was that in the 1950s or so she wrote this manifesto, and it's just an amazing little clue.
Yeah, I think it might have been 62 or something like that, but anyhow, about that time. Yeah. So basically, it's essentially 60 years ago. Yeah. Well, there's one of the things, the last of the 4 foundations of sustainable places was something that and this is a very difficult discussion to have, but the idea of a securable place, that in those inevitably less secure times in every city's future, how do you secure the most vulnerable parts of the urbanism, which is things like the center of the block or the mid block, and leave the streets open for everyone to travel to the city, but in a safe way, with things like Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street and a lot of other techniques. And like I say, it's a very difficult decision to have, because we're still within the kind of the shadow of the emptying out of the American cities in the late 60s, early 70s. And whether you were someone who stayed and suffered from what the city devolved into, or whether you were one of the ones that had to leave your home and make a home somewhere else, there's scars on both sides of that equation. And so it's not easy to talk about, but it's essential to talk about, because of the whole thing of repeating mistakes that we're not willing to acknowledge. So but yeah, that's because if the people leave, the place is not sustained. So yeah, it's important.
Can I ask you a question about, you mentioned in your book, the concept of death by modernism, and I always I have to defend modernism, because when I think of architects like Edwin Lutyens, who's the most modern architect, that's why I love and adore his work so much. Yet he's reinterpreting classical tradition, but he is that modern. But how do you compare sort of modernism to what I see the disease of architecture has always been the international style? And I think you even have a little twist on that. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, you know, the first international style has persisted for about 2,500 years now, give or take, and that is the classical tradition. I mean, because it spread all over the world, you know, so it's something that is as international as anything, and the but the key is that you know, and of course that's at one end of the vernacular classical spectrum, so. But the key is that it typically is used for the most refined buildings in town, where you go and spend some time, like a public building of some sort. And so even if say, for example, you went to a church building or something, and it was in 500 years ago, it wasn't able to be heated to, you know, regular everyday comfort today, you know, you could wrap up and go and spend the time and go back home. But when you get home, if on 100-degree day, if it doesn't shelter you properly, you might die of a heat stroke. On a 0-degree day, you might freeze to death. So again, it gets back to staying alive. So at the most vernacular end, you need to be able to really condition to the regional conditions in climate and culture, to calibrate to that, I should say. And then of course obviously the most classical are often the like a monument, you know, monument, which is can be outdoors, you know, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, and so forth, and so you expect to encounter that. It's not like going home and laying in bed and being comfortable. It's a different type of experience. Now, the international style, so-called, of you know, that term in recent times, that's been with us close to 100 years now, something like that. It actually, well, I'll put it this way: the classical we have found endearing for all these generations, because it is the most human. What's recently been termed the international style has spread because it has been the most mechanical. In other words, it can be systematized. You can produce a bunch of this stuff and you can send it all over the world. Doesn't matter what the conditions are, and it can be okay as a memorial as well, but as homes, if you build the same style home in Nova Scotia and in the Bahamas, you will get a very different experience of how comfortable home is and how endearing it is to you. And so it really is, instead of being built around us as humans, it's built more around the principles of the assembly line, and you know, evidence of the factory is opposed to evidence of humanity, I guess would be another way to put it.
It's funny, as you talk about that, you talk about the engineering and the technology. I just think about Vitruvius and firmness, commodity firmness and delight. Really, that's without that aspect of firmness, then it's not architecture. It's going to fail. It's not going to be resilient.
Well, you know, in terms of resilience, it's fascinating to me what has come out in just the last 2-3 months about Roman concrete, and how what was regarded in the you know, microscopic analysis of it, what was regarded is for a long time as being an imperfection or a failing of it actually is these, and I forget I forget the chemical composition of all this, but basically it's these little tiny little particles that help it to self-heal, and there is no steel rebar, it's just mass concrete, and that is able to be, like the Pantheon, of course, is been here 1900 and however many years it is, and so and self-healing all the time, so the more we learn about what people once knew about building, the more fascinating it is that they, well, I'll put it this way, if they weren't able to be resilient in many ways, not just their concrete, but in many ways, they wouldn't have survived, and we wouldn't be having this conversation today because we wouldn't be here. So it just, again, it's what we call sustainability today is again the wisdom of staying alive and keeping future generations alive.
All this talk always makes me think of how to achieve it. It's all, a lot of people can agree on all these ideals, but when you talk about the LEED standard was one way to try to help nudge people in the right direction, but then that's not attuned to actual walkability and all these other aspects, and so it has its faults. But we just live and have always lived in some form of capitalism. It's just, I work for money. So that's kind of the nature of mankind, of humankind, I should say. So what do you feel about encouraging these outcomes through government? In other words, there's no reason why, a weekly, monthly shareholder driven company is going to be motivated to do anything except financial punishment, if you will, like we just seen in the television recently with Fox News. Like, what do you see there being a role beyond just like lecturing and talking about this stuff and all that for the government to say, look, outcomes 200 years from now, 300 years from now that we want to achieve, we have to do these certain things, and therefore we have to credit or penalize certain behavior to get us to live more sustainably, to not pave over every surrounding metropolis, and then how do we achieve that in a system that just promotes media eyeballs through lies a lot of times, so that now we live in all these little different silos. And even though I can talk perfectly well with someone from the opposite politics of me regarding where we should eat, how we should build and do this and do that, when it comes to long-term policy, they're the devil and I'm the devil, and it just kind of falls apart. So how do you have an idea of how your ideals can actually be implemented?
At high levels of government, I have no standing whatsoever. They don't even know I exist. And so all of my efforts have been for decades now to try to say, how do you empower the townspeople to build the town kind of from the grassroots up? And I will say this, that when the first edition of the Bahamas book came out, the prime minister at the time was he was actually considering making it essentially the national pattern book, and everybody'd have to build that way, and that didn't happen. I think he got voted out of officers. I forget the politics behind it, but anyhow, at some point in time he was no longer in office, and he may have retired for all I know. But there was on Harbor Island, in Dunmore Town on Harbor Island, there was a group of local builders that I had never met any of them. When the book first came out, the first cases that were delivered, Orion Lindroth, who had commissioned the book with some friends and colleagues, called up very excitedly. He says, "Steve, you wouldn't believe what's happening." I said, "Tell me, what is it?" He said, the builders have broken open the first cases of the books, and they're looking through there and say, "Oh, that's why my granddad did that. We need to do that, because they lost all the wisdom of the why behind it." Now, without ever having met a single one of them, they had the book for a dozen years before I came back to start to work on the second edition. When I got there, I found that they had made that architecture a true living tradition again, including doing things that would never have occurred to me to do. For example, when the British came to the Bahamas, they had very low ceiling cottages, and because of the fact that in Great Britain, in a very different climate, you want to keep the warmth down around you in the winter. Whereas what should have happened in the Bahamas should have been very tall ceilings, let the heat rise. What they did in some of these houses, and this is one example of many things that they came up with on their own that wasn't actually in the book, but based on the principles in the book. Okay, hugely important that it was principle based. With quite a number of the houses that they were remaking, the colonial houses, but where the bedrooms upstairs were just tiny, it's kind of like you need to inhabit them like that. Then they actually took out it over the main living spaces. They took out the tiny bedrooms and put a bedroom wing kind of cottage scale in the back around a courtyard. And so then they have these large 2-story spaces that let the heat rise. That's what Bahamians should have always been doing, but except for the cultural precedent was so strong. And that's one example of many things that they came up with on their own, because it's principle based. If it's particulars based, like a normal town architect review process goes something like this. It's thou shalt do this because I have better taste than you. So, no, you don't. Yes, I do. No, you don't. And it goes, and so you might get compliance after a lot of effort. But if it's principle based, then it produces both wisdom over time, and it also produces a tremendous amount of creativity within the tradition. I'm not against creativity. I'm just against the idea of inventing something never seen before because of the necessity of uniqueness. And anything that is a complete invention is, it's like Thomas Edison and the light bulb. What did he do? 2,500 things before he hit on one. If we have a 0.04% or whatever that percentage would be of chance of success, that's a hideously bad batting average. But if people know why we do what we do and are allowed to think again, I vote for the grassroots. That's what I want to do is help.
What's interesting about what you're saying is that they learned this from a book. They learned this from, so to speak, a library. When I went to visit my grandfather down in Puerto Rico, I went to the old town, and the little houses had huge ceilings. And I was like, well, that looks dumb. Why would you do that? And then, of course, it didn't take long for someone to tell me, hey, knucklehead, heat rises. And I thought, oh, that's good. Okay, they're so smart. But why wouldn't they have just understood or created these things on their own? In other words, aside from the government, which was sort of my original question about how do we implement these things? Are you sort of saying, let's get them books. Let's tell them, hey, this is your tradition. This explains everything. Do you know what I mean? And especially Bahamas, which is more isolated than, let's say, the middle of America, where huge torrents of commercial traffic get you everything you want whenever you want. The incentive for the guy in Kentucky or whatever to do what his grandfather did for the reasons he did, when he's like, look, I got to go to a truck show in 2 hours. I don't really have time for your discussion. I'm going to go to Home Depot. I'm going to crank this out. And, all your fancy talk is nice. How do we, I'm not saying the guy's dumb. The guy probably knows 20,000 things more than I knew about everything, trucks, this, planting, culture, whatever. But my point is that, how can we get it from being just this top down, we always romanticize the grassroots, but then even in your story, it was top down. So is there a way to get it to literally get through this economic system that makes it so easy just to do the junkiest thing?
Well, I think that the real key to that is those 4 words of we do this because of the fact that all the patterns were framed that way, then the builders could actually, because it explained why, then they were able to buy into it. Whereas without the whys, what you're left with is just the model. In other words, by that I mean or the product. And actually, the top-down story in the Bahamas was in the 1960s the government brought in, they said, we need to have some new patterns for building. Let's bring in some designs from the US. And so basically what they were doing was building. So the standard model for the Bahamas was basically suburban sprawl housing, which was not at all suited for there, just period. And that would have persisted had the builders in recent times not known why. That really is what made the difference.
But what drove them to that why is what I think beauty might come in. In other words, when they see someone drawing from the place that everyone is telling them is lovely, that they know is lovely, but then all of a sudden they say, look, there's a reason behind this beauty. It's not just, oh yeah, someone does have the taste, but it is the thing that drew them there to the first place. It is the thing that, so in other words, without that emotional engagement, when you don't talk about beauty and the importance of it, because it is subjective, because you can't put it on a chart and you can't systematize it like a database and piece of information, it's like I can have you over for dinner and go through 10 different points to give you a great dinner. But if you don't feel like I'm giving you a nice experience, if I haven't arranged the place just so, and I don't talk to you just so, I can hit all the standard points and you're just going to feel like, well, that was great. See you later. So to me, that goes back to maybe David's question about the international style. And really when they got rid of the human aspect, the subjective aspect, which is supposed to be make it null and void to talk about beauty, because, even the Romans understood taste, you don't dispute taste. So forget that 18th century intellectuals in Germany. I agree that they talked a little too much, but they weren't the first to understand that beauty is subjective. So I think by running away from the subjective nature of beauty because we're so afraid to disagree, we're just abandoning the baby with the bathwater. So to my mind, at least, that is the importance of beauty, is that nobody really makes a heavy purchase, especially a home, without feeling emotionally engaged. You can talk about the insulation, you can talk about the 30-year shingles, and the man, or to be stereotypical, it's going to be like, well, terrific, that's going to, I can invest this much and that much. But I know as an architect, if that woman or a man or whatever, it doesn't go, damn, like I'm nowhere, so that's what I love about the lovability, because to me lovability is an aspect of beauty. And that's why I was curious about your original idea of the functionalist quality, which is, makes sense for the rational brain, but doesn't always get you to say, will you marry me?
Yeah, well, I tell you what, let's stay in the Bahamas for a moment, but before I go back there,
because that's nice.
I would say that in general, beauty is one of the high ideals, obviously. I mean, that goes without question. But I would suggest that should be the destination, but the vehicle for getting there, to change the culture of building in a place, the vehicle for getting there is storytelling. It's the we do this because part of, because I'll tell you what the story was in the Bahamas when I came back and was spending a lot. Of course, I've been there a lot working on stuff, but not with the people, more with just with Orion and the builders and developers and stuff. And when I was there working on the second edition, one evening we're out with some friends and colleagues and met a local boat captain, and they were telling him what I was doing working on the book and all that. And he said, "What do you mean?" And I started describing to him. He said, "Oh, you mean the colonial architecture?" I think, "Oh, wait a minute," because that's of a long gone era. That story was that we've moved beyond that. We're into the modern era now, and that actually is now in the colonial era. Bahamians never had to endure slavery, so it was a different story. It's not the same formula, but it's a similar formula of because even if you weren't a slave, if you were a colonial place, then the colonizers were kind of your masters, and so that story cast what should have been considered the birthright architecture of the Bahamas in in such a light. And I was saying, oh man, how do I reframe this in such a way that it's your birthright isn't Orlando sprawl housing, you know, it's something that's so much more calibrated to you, to the people and to the place. And so that really was that really the first and last chapters of that second edition were totally rewritten to it. In both Orion and I, we've been trying to figure out a lot of this stuff for decades anyway. But that really, his question that night, oh, so do you mean the colonial architecture? That just kind of shook me to my core as a storyteller.
Was that a good thing or a bad thing that he was saying, or maybe neither? I don't know. What was his point?
For him, it was just a casual observation based on what the current narrative had been, the current story of architecture in the Bahamas. For me, as a storyteller, it shook me to my core. It's like, is this a hopeless thing? You know, you got one little town, Dunmore Town, where they've made it a great thing. The rest of the nation, it hadn't really changed. And so, but it was great, but uncomfortable food for thought for several months. It was most of a year until I finally sort of was able to reframe the story in a way that I thought that really answered a bunch of other questions. One of them, actually, I'll tell you what it was. Let's go back to Rome. In this case, we're going to travel a little bit. In Rome, of course, it was obviously the capital of the Western world for centuries, but by the middle of the medieval era, those same hills sitting beside that same river with many of the same buildings that it endured had declined to the point of there being, I think there was probably 10,000 residents at some point, and it would have been the capital of the world before then. And I've heard stories that the garbage had piled up so much over the centuries that women were hanging clotheslines between the capital, the column capitals of the Pantheon to hang out clothes, you know. So while the place hadn't changed and the buildings hadn't changed, those had been sustained for centuries. The society that inhabited those buildings in those places, in that place, it changed dramatically, since antiquity. And so I came to realize that there really should be a third set of foundations, and that is foundations for a sustainable society. And unlike the first 8, four places, 4 buildings, these are 4 that change over the years, because I think that the number one foundation of a sustainable society today, at least in the U.S., I'm no expert for societies around the world, but number one is education. Because if in a place, if education in the broad sense, not just K through 12 and higher education, but if education in broad sense is not sustainable, people don't go to the place. You know, they will leave if the schools get bad, and that's just one aspect of education. And then the second is economy. Is the economy something that is built up from the cultivation of local businesses, or is it all piped in from halfway around the world? You know, if it's piped in, then the place is on life support. Because if the pipes are cut, then it's not, you can't live there. And then culture is the third one, and not just do you have a big arena where you can bring in big national or international acts, but do you have the artists and the musicians and the other aspects of culture that you're cultivating within your place, that they can grow up and become, and like, for example, one place that I work at town architect, the Village of Providence in Huntsville, Alabama, they have a strong culture of having people start out in an incubator for one person, and sometimes they've grown to as large as an entire building in the town center. Over the years, we need to be doing that more than just begging to multinationals to come in and put an outpost of their corporation in our place. And then the last one is one that would not have even existed 100 years ago, because everyone got so much physical activity just by working each day, and that is wellness. What is it about a place that encourages and fosters wellness of the people that live there? Because if we're not well, then things don't end well.
Can I give you a step back to the Bahamas and give you a real plug? So, for those of you who haven't seen Steve's books, he has an amazing library of books that he's written. But we keep talking about this book in particular, which is an amazing encyclopedia of pieces and beliefs and everything you can imagine in the Bahamas. And what I wanted to say is that around 2005, I had an opportunity to build a family compound on the island of Abaco. So the first thing that I did was I bought 10 books of culture, from Junkanoo to British loyalists to and then we took that information and obviously the planting and everything. So we had these 10 books. And then we rented a boat, and we basically went from island to island taking pictures of everything around. And we spent time in both Nassau and both in Abaco. And my point is that there is 10 times more information in this book than the 10 books I have upstairs. It is mind-boggling. I'm talking about colors of paints, not 3 colors. I'm talking about trim paints, wall paints, flora. It is an amazing encyclopedia of the culture of the Bahamas. And it made me, as I was looking through this, aside from the fact, like, where were you when I needed you? It made me think of Russell Versace, who does these wonderful lectures about the regions in America. And he traces those regions based on what people immigrated at what time and how they affected that region. It does an amazing job. Big arrows of, I mean, anything from one thing. Why are a lot of Portuguese Azorians in Fall River and in New Bedford? Well, because there was a volcano in the Azores, and Kennedy brought over 10,000 people to save them because their island was going away. So like these amazing tidbits of information that make up what is a local regional. And that's a long explanation to say that I'm blown away by the book. And it makes me wonder if there should be a book like this for every region. Like really and truly, like,
Of course there should.
It's a pattern book. It's like anybody can go. It's almost like Sears and Roebuck from 100 years ago. Anybody can take this book, and you know what? They can actually like do 80% of what we do. Anyway, that's your plug.
Thank you. My goal, by the way, was in the work of Christopher Alexander has been hugely influential on me, dating back to, actually it was Christmas break, a month after the Mooresville trip, when I discovered the timeless way of building in pattern language over Christmas break, and I was home and did nothing but lay on the couch in the living room, my parents' house, and consume both of those books cover to cover. So that's been hugely important. But one thing about Alexander's work, it's kind of the international set of human-based patterns, or you might think of it as Latin, what Latin is to to modern languages today, from a European basis. And my goal with that book and the other books like it was to do not the Latin, but the regional dialect in today's, a book for the living, a book about, Latin is pretty much a dead language. I know there's a few specialists that use it, but these are meant to be books for the living, not books for the dead.
right? Onward, right, everyone?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, and so you've done the Bahamas, and you've also, like, what areas has Steve Mouzon sort of like nailed, and what is the rest, what other geography in the continent and beyond needs care, isn't already being attended to by.
Yeah, actually, the very first one was in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and it was the living tradition of the American Gulf Coast. But that one has not been published broadly. It's so very few people have seen it. I didn't go and print 10,000 of them or whatever. And so, but in the U.S. there's like 7 different NOAA climatic zones, and there's some of those that are split by mountains, for example, like Low Country Carolina, and then Appalachians, which are similar climatically, but culturally they're very different. Once you cross the mountains, it's my folks, which are the rednecks, or the hillbillies, you might say, as opposed to the folks on the coast, and so I think there's like, when you divide for those conditions, there's like 9 or 10 different zones in the U.S., which there should be a living tradition pattern book for each. And if I live long enough and can figure out how to make that happen, that's what I love to do. But better yet, it would be great because we don't all live forever, and so it'd be great if those books become a pattern for someone else later on, to pick up and carry it to many regions around the world. Because, like I say, what has happened in the Bahamas in particular as a result of that has been just, it was basically, it was my wildest dreams in the beginning, but it actually happened, at least in small places. I hope it happens nationally at some point, but anyhow, that we need to put the wisdom of building for the regional conditions in climate and culture back into the hands of the people. So we're not just buying products, we're building places.
So much of your career seems to have been, it clearly has been dedicated to dissemination of the good word, right? And as an architect and in the professional sort of position you're in, I think you are interfacing with, Joe Blow, non-professional architect people at a much higher volume than a typical, most of the rest of us architects are. And you've clearly spent a lot of energy figuring out how to communicate these concepts in ways that Joe Blow can sort of onboard and, do their own advocating, right? As you sort of explained in the Bahamian example. Do you ever, when you're talking, at conferences, is there an offering that you have developed in teaching architects or the design professionals how to communicate sort of to the people beyond our little ivory tower spheres?
Well, I try to take very simple approaches to things. For example, in the Southeast, at least, what should be a bed mold, something that's essentially a summer reversa, tends to end up being, they'll put a crown down there and say, well, I can get a crown. And this was a mistake I made early in my career as well. Okay. But how do you put that in terms that regular folks will understand? So I ask a builder, can I borrow your hat? And so they hand me a hat. They say, putting what should be a crown, at the very top of a wall, if instead you put it under your chin, how ridiculous does that look? And or I'll say, if you have things that you call shutters, but they don't shut, if they just screw on the wall and do nothing, you should call them by their proper name, which is a screw on do nothing. Now, how many screw on do nothing do you want on this house? or a brick mold. There's a hint there in what it should be. It's a molding that you put around a door or window in a brick wall, where the brick wall in its lintel obviously is a structure. But if you're putting it into a frame wall where the jamb casing and the head casing are allegories to the structure supporting the wall inside the wall to make the opening, then it'll look like a toothpick. So if it's not a brick wall, don't use a brick mold, you know. And so but we need to get better at simple storytelling like that everybody can understand. Speaking of that, real quickly, I don't know how much time we have, but one thing I'm working on now is in both Andres Duani and Nathan Norris has said for years that this needs to happen, and that is an alternate lexicon of architectural terms that are things that everybody can understand. The one example of that is you know, everybody knows that windows are the eyes of a building. Okay, but if you think about it, the eyebrow, the lintel, is something that normally, you know, this is meant to get rain off this way. Okay, so it doesn't run down in your eyes, and so that's and so the lintels actually do in the you know, the drip mold and all that do similar jobs, you know. And of course there's the cheekbone, okay, and that's like the sill, you know. And so it sounds really silly right now talking like that, but I think that if we can come up with this alternate lexicon based on the organic world, first of all, the human body, human arrangement in proportions and all this, and maybe even other parts of the organic world that everybody understands. Everybody, you know, we have eyes and nose and mouth and all this, and because we're human, and so that's a goal, is to someday have a different way of speaking that makes people think about our buildings in a natural way as opposed to a mechanical way.
Do you have a little bit more time for a Q&A if anybody wants to ask?
Absolutely, I'll be delighted.
Okay, great. So there's a Q&A button on the bottom. So if you basically just push that, a window will open up and just ask away. And I had a question for you. And I wanted to respond to Dan's comment earlier about, I heard Andres Duani lecture in Charleston about 7 or 8 years ago, and he basically talked for an entire hour on what he called coding. So I'm sure and basically the entire hour he was talking about, we need to go to the towns and we need to help them rewrite their zoning laws, and he called it coding. So I thought that it was sort of we kind of talked a little bit about that earlier. So there are solutions, but we need to come at it from different angles that maybe we didn't come at it before.
Well, you know, a zoning code or an urban code, depending on what they call it in a place, is a top-down solution with the force of law. So, and if you don't do the right thing, they'll send out the police and they'll shut your job down. Okay. And you may have to pay a lot of fines and all this. Being the advocate for things from the ground up as opposed to force of law top down. You know, force of law top down is what brought all the American sprawl models to the Bahamas in the 60s. I regard obviously the Living Tradition book is a code book, you know, because it's coding by patterns. But my goal is to make it a persuasive code, not a coercive code. Okay, you know, so this like, wow, this is a better way of building because of this. Now that we know the why, or the whys, then it persuades people that this is a better way, and then we have a chance. And let me throw this in too, in terms of looking for individual patterns in a place. If you're coding in a place that you're not that familiar with, you know, an instance is not a pattern. So you have to see things happening a few times or several times before you realize, oh, that's an important pattern here. Once you have once you have a bunch of photographs of it, then you need to ask yourself, first of all, why did the old folks do this? By old folks, I mean dead folks. And then you would ask, is this a reason that only applied to when they were alive, or is this something that resonates with humans today? If it can be a pattern of the living, as opposed to just a pattern of the dead, then your next goal is to be able to tell a story about that pattern that is rational and compelling and inspiring. If you can do those three things, then you have a chance of getting people to build according to that pattern. If you can't do those three things, you have no chance. So that's kind of the foundation principles of a persuasive code.
We have our first comment from Patty Steinschneider, who's asking you to make a big plus. He said, is it he or she? I'm sorry, Patty. Put in a big plug for the CNU 31 at the end of May in Charlotte. Talk about it and say a little bit about the CNU.
Oops.
Oh, we lost
Oh,
you.
you're back. You're back.
Oh.
Go.
Oh, sorry. Okay. It's interesting because there were two times that I found my people. The first time was that I was aware of DPZ's work in Seaside, dating back to my college days, and then I lost track of everybody. There were very few of us in college that actually kind of shared a lot of these goals and hopes. But in the non-internet years of that time, I felt I'd totally lost my people, and that maybe I was the only one left alive that cared about building places people love and things people love within them. And then I got this emailing in like 1994, I guess it was, from some group called the ICA, and for an event in New York City. And there were a lot of speakers with really great information, but then one guy named Alvin Holm got up and he was talking about the master adorning his creation, and that was an event that really I found my people. They live, they exist. They're still out there, because I totally lost track. And then fast forward a little bit, it was 99, I guess it's about 5 years later, when I went to the first event at Seaside that Andres would normally put on in December of each year, kind of a New Urbanism 101. And that was the beginning of my involvement with of actually, I'd seen them from afar years ago, but actually being involved with the New Urbanism, and it has been absolutely transformative. One thing that CNU has always done, basically, it's a very open organization. All you have to do is show up with useful ideas about something, and you have a seat at the table. It's not like you have to come up through the farm team or whatever and eventually be recognized at higher levels. It's a very welcoming organization. If you're with a bunch of new urbanists, we always overload the table, meaning that if it's a six top, we'll have 10 or 12 people around it, because everybody's so excited and engaged with what we can do to change the way that we build places people love. And actually, the interesting thing is that at Congresses, there's always a lot of excellent sessions, and actually the Urban Guild has had they're on track for a number of years now, dating back to 2018, I guess it was, and so I spend a lot of time there typically, but the most valuable parts of the Congresses are actually not the sessions, but the conversations that happen between passionate people in the hallways, outside the sessions. And so, I could give you the normal pitch and talk about just the approved content, but really the best stuff is the idea building and community building that you do with the community of like-minded individuals when you're at a Congress. If that's the way I see that a couple of y'all are AIA, but and I was a member of the AIA for many years, but and went to their conventions, but really CNU is the one thing that I go to every year. It's just top of the list, and just Patty, I hope you're not disappointed by that, but anyhow, it's one of it's another one of those I found my people places that
you didn't
Well,
even
I'd like
mention the dance party, Steve.
I'd like to plug this CNU too. I mean, so I worked at DPZ long ago, and there's been so many great ideas that have come out of there that get labeled traditional and this and that, when they're really just common sense solutions to everyday problems. So that's just the nature of politics. But one of the things that I found tying into what I think David was alluding to, and back to what I was saying about the government's role, that I found fascinating was the idea of removing government and allowing the people to literally do what makes sense. And really that is driven by, I think, getting sued. Like everyone's so worried about getting sued that every law is not really based on, well, it's based on saving your life safety, but really life safety of your bank account, because, the moment you get someone attacks you, and I love our judicial system, but it's sort of designed to milk you dry. So if I've seen, for example, Gavin Newsom, I just read recently, was talking about how to deal with California's housing shortage. And, and even in DC, they've had Catholic universities talked about it. And it's basically all about reducing regulations, allowing the market to build up where it wants to by speeding up the permitting process, by this, by that. And so if there was a way of doing that without it falling into the hands of the right or the left, and if there was a framing that just said, look, we're all going to benefit by the economic activity that happens when, wow, I know people want to live now downtown, but can I get into the game? No, I can't, because I don't afford the lawyers and the this and the that to do all the years of environmental studies and, legal analysis to get into the game. So again, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that that's one of those wonderful ideas that have come out of the CNU that I think has worked in many places, but is needs to somehow come on board, whether it's intelligent work from the government or the government intelligently removing itself, which is like saying, hey, I'm only going to build one good house for you, so you'll never need to hire me again. It's inherent to not want to do that because you want to do more. So the government doesn't necessarily just cut itself out because, gosh, they need to pay for Christmas presents and, whatever else people need to do in their family lives. So again, I'm throwing too much out of there, but I like that. I like that solution too. It's not just what the government can do, but what happens when the government removes itself by reducing the liability of getting sued, so that you can just build the way you want to, and just not saying, hey, so I don't know what the answer is, but I found that really compelling.
Well, I'll say this you mentioned right, left in early on in actually my first substantive post on ProUrb way back over 20 years ago now, was to say that the new urbanism should never become the lapdog of any political party.
Right.
Because long after everyone has forgotten the names of all but two presidents in each century, I think there'll be two, kind of the top two that people remember. But long after the rest have been totally forgotten, they'll still be walking down the streets that are being planned today.
Yep.
Okay. So when you're building a place, that is more important than politics, because politics only lasts for 4 years. Unless you get recalled, whereas urbanism can last for centuries or millennia. And when I first got on this kind of speaking circuit way back 20 something years ago now. At that point, I quickly realized that if you say anything that reveals your political leanings, you immediately lose half the room. So after the 2000 presidential election, I have not told nobody after the election, not even my wife, who I voted for.
Come on.
No,
I can tell what you are just by the way you're dressed. No, I'm kidding.
You know, I'm gonna leave that alone. But
no, I don't care. I don't care what you are. That's the point. It
Yeah.
doesn't, you want taxes high, you want taxes low. What does it have to do with the quality of walking down the street? Nothing.
We have a couple more questions. So the next one, I'm going to rudely interrupt you before I let you answer it. And the question is from Bradley Greiner or Greena. It's fantastic discussion based on your experience. What have you seen as the cost and timing difference between existing construction methods versus a more intentional, durable building style? Is building beautiful and durable projects 20% more expensive or 20% longer? And before I let you answer it, it reminds me of our next guest, which is Susan Szanka. Wrote an amazing book around 2000. And basically her entire premise is figure out your budget, spend the money on good design, and build with enduring, resilient materials, and build a little bit smaller house and that's how you're going to be at the same budget. And so anyway, sign up. I'm sure it's going to be amazing. She's an amazing woman. But go ahead, Steve, take that one.
Well, actually, let me make a note on that, and that is that she is actually one of my heroes, and I met her for the first time at CNU several years ago, probably 15 years ago, something like that. But yeah, I a great admirer of her work, but you never know who you're going to run across if you show up. So you should show up. But in terms of building more durably, Clay Chapman of the 1,000-Year House can actually build because everything is done in a very unburdened way in terms of, we normally build walls that are what I call stud sandwiches. It's studs sandwiched between a bunch of other layers of stuff that if anything fails, it becomes very fragile, and whereas he's out there and with his crew, and they're a crew of apprentices, by the way, because everybody that works for him is an apprentice. He's doing that in the hopes that they take it and actually start their own practice, as they have done. There's quite a number of them out there now that are building because of the fact they apprentice with Clay. But he can, in a reasonable amount of time, having to do with building a stud sandwich house, he can put up the walls and the timber structure, the timber frame of the floor and so forth, in a comparable amount of time. And Clay and Nathan Norris and I and a few other people were out at the Builder Show. We think we need to go out every few years and kind of educate ourselves. We're walking around, and there was one booth where they had this really nifty kind of it looks like a really fancy garage door that basically it rolls up to open a room as opposed to doing the sliding stuff, like a lot of them do now. And it was really kind of cool looking. It almost looked like it was made out of the Hope's windows from years, the metal windows. And I asked the guy, what would this run? And he said, well, this model right here is about $40,000. Clay was standing there beside me. We walked away, and Clay said, the last house I built was built with $40,000 in materials for all of the walls. He said, so my choice is, do I want this one door or do I want all the walls? So I don't know if that tells you everything you want to know about time and cost, but if you build simply according to longstanding traditions of stuff known to work, as opposed to assembling many pieces of stuff, that is fragile and not resilient, then it's a different world. But see, in the world of industrial construction, where they're wanting to sell you other products and stuff, they have a mythology that clay does not actually exist. You know, that he can't be possible today. People can't possibly do that. And so he's just somebody that people talk about, this imaginary character. But I've laid brick with him. He is not imaginary.
You missed the opportunity. If you were younger, you needed to drop your mic. That was awesome. That was a fantastic answer. Okay, so one more. John Hooker, is colonial architecture in the Bahamas loved as authentic, or is it disliked as a representation of an unhappy historical period?
Ooh, good question.
Because of the story, the prevailing story, which I was not aware of when I wrote the first edition. As a matter of fact, I was out on a boat traveling island to island, probably about the same time you were, taking pictures for the book to begin with. So we were probably on a parallel path. And I spent basically no time with the people. I was just looking at the buildings. And so I didn't know about this narrative of, oh, that's just, that's colonial architecture. And so therefore it must be old and outdated. You know, if not, we were the colonized and they were the colonizers, right. You know. Spending a lot of time with the people in the Bahamas on the second, you know, with working on the second edition, then becoming aware of that narrative that I hadn't known anything about before, it had strong standing at the time, and that also goes back to the fact that if you ignore the society, you know, if you just think about places and buildings and ignore the society part, it's an incomplete picture. And so it's something that my hope was and is to help change the narrative, to say this was what got built here. There were things like the ceiling height that came directly from Great Britain, but there were a lot of things that, you know, one of the things, and here's, think about it, if you're in a place that's uncomfortable in hot weather, then what do? Well, what the Bahamians did, instead of raising the ceilings, they actually created they were some of the greatest builders of outdoor rooms in the world. And so this idea of al fresco living, they became world famous for that. Matter of fact, you have some of the wealthiest people in the world that came to participate. There's a place called Lyford Key that's almost all billionaires that, you know, people like, that's where Sean Connery died, for example. That was his last years were there. So there were calibrations, but the calibrations literally made it and what the people didn't see at the time. But I'm hoping that the book helps, and I think it is to see that the sum total is not just British architecture dropped in unchanged. But it actually is the birthright of the people of this place. And so that's the intent, that's the hope and intent, and we'll see how it plays out in the long run.
The interesting thing is when I bought those 10 books prepping, I actually called up Russell Versace, who was a friend, and he basically told me an hour long and taught me the sort of the history of how the background. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
Be a British loyalist. And so this was one of the best fire chats we've ever had. We're in debt to you. Thank you so much. We will put this online within the next week or so, and we'll send a link. And if anybody wants to see this part of it, they can just go to our website, architecturaldelight.org, and it'll be up there under past shows. And there's also sign up for a couple of coming shows. And again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much
Steve,
for having me on. This has been an absolute delight from my perspective as well.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.
Look forward to meet you in person. Bye-bye, Steve.
Likewise.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.